She threw the lantern, not at a person, not at a wall. She hurled it straight into the snow outside her uncle's estate, watching the flame die in the white dark, because it was the only thing she owned that she could afford to destroy. Everything else, her father's land, his cattle records, his signed deed, his name, had already been taken. And if she stayed one more night under Charles Whitmore's roof, she would lose the one thing he hadn't managed to strip from her yet: herself. If you're watching this story for the first time, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell and drop the name of your city in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And I promise you, if you stay until the very end, this one is going to stay with you long after it's over. Emily Harper pulled her coat tighter, tucked the leather envelope against her chest, the one holding every forged document, every manipulated ledger, every fraudulent signature her uncle had used to bury her father's legacy. And she walked into the Wyoming night with nothing but frozen boots, and the kind of courage that only shows up when a person has run completely out of choices. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she wasn't going back. Wyoming Territory, December 1886. The cold that settled over the valley that winter was not the ordinary cold of mountain elevation or early frost. It was a killing cold, the kind that silenced birds in the middle of a sentence, that turned mud roads to iron before noon, that made grown men rethink every decision that had brought them to this part of the country. The kind of cold that the old-timers said only came once every decade. And when it did, it took something, an animal, a crop, a person, before it released its grip on the land. Emily Harper had been walking through it for 3 hours. She was 26 years old, with dark hair plastered flat against her cheeks from the wind, a face that had once been soft and open and trusting, and a body that had spent years absorbing the particular cruelty that the world reserves for women who take up more space than other women are comfortable with. She was a plus-sized woman, tall and broad-shouldered, and she had learned early that people looked at her size before they looked at her face, and at her face before they listened to her words. She had grown used to it the way a person grows used to a stone in their boot, not without pain but without surprise. What she had not grown used to was being called a liar by the man who had watched her grow up. "You are confused, Emily," her uncle had told her 3 nights ago, sitting behind her father's desk in her father's study, with her father's name carved into the wood above the fireplace. "Grief does strange things to a woman's mind, especially a woman like you." A woman like you. She had understood exactly what he meant. He had meant a woman no one will believe. He had meant a woman who should be grateful for whatever scraps of protection a man like me decides to offer. He had meant a woman who, if she opens her mouth, will be dismissed before she finishes her first sentence. Emily had looked at him for a long time without answering. Then she had gone to her room, packed what she could carry, and waited. She had not thrown the lantern out of rage. She had thrown it out of clarity, because rage clouds judgment, and she needed hers perfectly sharp for what came next. The storm rolled in from the north sometime around 9 o'clock. Emily felt it before she saw it, a pressure change in the air, a stillness that preceded catastrophe, the way the whole world seemed to hold its breath for 3 seconds before something terrible broke loose. Then the wind arrived, and with it the snow. And within 20 minutes the road she'd been following disappeared entirely beneath a white sheet that didn't care about her plans, or her evidence, or her survival. She kept walking. She didn't know what else to do. She had heard there was a ranch somewhere in this valley, a working outfit not large, run by a man who kept to himself. She had heard this from the stable boy at her uncle's property, a 13-year-old named Eli, who had whispered directions to her while pretending to adjust her saddle 3 days ago. She had no horse. She had no map. She had only the boy's remembered directions and a general sense that if she kept the mountain peak to her left and the frozen creek to her right, she'd eventually find a gate. She found the gate just as her legs stopped working. Not dramatically. Not all at once. They simply stopped obeying her in the way that very cold legs do. One knee buckled, then the other, and she was down in the snow before she'd registered the fall. She stayed on her hands and knees for what felt like a long time, breathing through her nose because her mouth had stopped producing enough warmth to matter. Staring at the light, she could see through a gap in the trees ahead. A light. A window. She made herself stand. She made it to the door. And then she knocked. No, that's not the right word for what she did. She pounded. She slammed her fists against the wood because her fingers had lost all fine motor function, and she couldn't tell the difference between a knock and a hammer anymore. She pounded until the door vibrated in its frame, until the sound of it swallowed even the howl of the storm behind her, until she heard movement inside heavy footsteps. A voice muttering something she couldn't make out, and then a latch being thrown. The door opened. He was bigger than she'd expected. Samuel Walker stood in his own doorway, with a rifle held easy across his left arm, not raised, not aimed, but present and close, in the way of a man who had lived alone long enough to treat caution as a reflex rather than a choice. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that had been weathered by altitude and solitude, into something that wasn't quite handsome and wasn't quite hard, but lived somewhere in between. His jaw was dark, with several days of growth. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of clouds, but the flat gray of river stones. The kind of gray that has seen weather and decided not to be moved by it anymore. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Please," she said. That was all she had left. One word. He didn't move. His eyes moved over her, not in the way she was used to men's eyes moving over her, which was to say, not unkindly, but assessing in the way of a man who has learned that whatever appears at your door in a blizzard usually comes with consequences attached. "You alone," he said. "Yes." "You armed?" "No." "You followed." That one stopped her. She thought of her uncle. She thought of the ledger in the envelope inside her coat. She thought of Charles Whitmore's voice 3 days ago, smooth and reasonable and utterly without mercy. "I don't know," she said because it was the truth. He looked at her for another long moment. The wind pushed against her back. She felt her knees begin to go again and locked them hard because she was not going to collapse in this man's doorway. She had made a promise to herself, actually said the words out loud in the dark of her uncle's empty guest room, that she would not collapse, not yet. Not until she got somewhere safe enough to afford it. "I only need a place to survive the night," she said. "That's all I'm asking. One night." Samuel Walker looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped aside. She walked past him into the heat of the cabin and immediately felt her legs give way. She caught herself on the doorframe, both hands all her weight, and stood there with her eyes closed and her teeth chattering so hard she could hear them while the warmth of the room moved over her like something alive. "Sit down before you fall down," he said somewhere behind her. "I'm not going to fall. You've been not going to fall for the last 30 seconds. She opened her eyes. There was a chair near the fireplace. She got herself to it and sat, and the sound of her coat hitting the seat cushions, stiff and crackling from ice, was somehow the most real sound she'd heard in days. Samuel set the rifle against the wall. He went to the fire and added 2 logs without looking at her. Then he moved to the kitchen, a small space separated from the main room by nothing but a difference in flooring, and she heard the sound of something being poured. He brought her a tin cup. She wrapped both hands around it and looked at what was inside. Coffee. Black. Hot enough to hurt. She drank it anyway. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer. He was looking at her coat. Specifically, she realized, at the way she was holding her arm pressed against her chest, protecting the envelope inside. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. A man who lived by himself in the mountains developed the particular attention of someone who has no one else to watch for him, which meant he watched everything. "You got something under there you're keeping dry," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have papers." "Papers worth walking through a blizzard for." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, and she met his eyes and didn't look away, because she was very tired of looking away from men who expected her to. "One night," he said finally. "One night," she agreed. He moved to the other side of the room, pulled a blanket from a chest near the wall, and held it out. She took it. He went to the window, checked the latch, and then without another word, he disappeared through a narrow doorway at the back of the cabin. Emily sat by the fire and let herself thaw. The cabin was small and clean in the way of a place maintained by habit rather than pride. a woman young, laughing, her face turned slightly away from the camera, as though she'd been caught in the middle of something. A chair sat near the window with a mending basket beside it that hadn't been touched in long enough that dust had gathered in the folds of the fabric. Emily looked at the photograph for a long time. She understood then something about the man who had let her in. He was not guarded because he was cruel. He was guarded because he had loved someone and lost her, and the particular mathematics of that kind of grief meant that every time you let a person past your door, you were agreeing to risk the equation all over again. She understood that mathematics very well. The fire crackled. The storm shook the walls. Emily pressed the envelope against her chest and listened to the sound of her own heart, which was beating hard and fast, and still somehow improbably beating. She thought of her father. She thought of the ledger inside her coat, with its rows of falsified numbers and forged signatures, and she thought about what it had cost her to walk out of that house with it. She thought about what it would cost her to do what she needed to do next. Outside, the storm hammered. The wind screamed. The cold pressed against every seam of the cabin, looking for a way in. And inside, Emily Harper stayed warm. In the morning, Samuel expected her to be gone. Women in trouble had two modes in his limited experience. They stayed too long or they vanished before daylight, and he had told himself he was prepared for either. He'd lain awake most of the night listening to the storm, which had given him the excuse not to examine too closely the way the cabin had felt different with another person breathing in it. Not better, not worse, just different. Like a room that had been empty long enough to forget it was supposed to have furniture. He came out at first light and she wasn't gone. She was in his kitchen. More accurately, she was standing at his stove, with her back to him, and her hair pinned up in a knot at the back of her neck, holding a spoon over a pan, in a way that suggested she was doing her very best with ingredients that were resisting her. He smelled the smoke before he saw the biscuits. He stood in the doorway and looked at what was on the cutting board. They were black on the bottom. They were raw in the middle. They were structurally speaking somewhere between a biscuit and a geological event. She turned around and looked at them too. Then she looked at him. And she laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not a nervous, apologetic, please don't be angry laugh. A real laugh, full-bodied, warm, surprised out of her, the kind of laugh that comes from a person who has been through enough that the only appropriate response to burned biscuits is genuine delight at the absurdity of it all. It was the first laugh Samuel Walker had heard inside these walls in 5 years. It hit him somewhere he hadn't known was still reachable. "I'll pay for the flour," she said when she'd gotten control of herself. "You don't need to pay for the flour." "I ruined a considerable amount of it." "I can see that." She picked up one of the biscuits and knocked it against the edge of the pan. It made a sound like a stone hitting iron. She looked at it with genuine scientific interest. "I think they might be salvageable," she said. "You could use them to repair the fence." She looked up at him surprised, and then she laughed again, and this time Samuel had to look away, because something was happening in the region of his chest that he didn't entirely have vocabulary for. "I'm Emily Harper," she said, "in case you didn't catch that last night." "I caught it." "And you're Samuel Walker. The stable boy mentioned you." That made him look back at her. "Eli. He gave me directions. He was very specific about the creek and the gate." She paused. "He's a good boy." "He talks too much." "He probably saved my life," she said, and the steadiness in her voice when she said it, the simple, unemotional acknowledgement of how close it had been, made something in Samuel's jaw go tight. "You hungry?" he said, desperately. "I'll make breakfast." He moved past her to the stove. She stepped aside to give him room, and for a moment they were standing very close together in the small kitchen, and he was aware of her in a way he hadn't been the night before. Aware of her height, which was considerable for a woman, aware of the breadth of her shoulders, aware of the way she moved through space with a kind of careful deliberateness, as though she had spent years learning to take up exactly as much room as necessary, and no more. He scrambled eggs, he fried salt pork, he made coffee that was actually coffee. She sat at the table and watched him cook without saying anything, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but not hostile. It was the silence of two people who were each trying to figure out how cautious to be. "How long have you been out here?" she asked finally. 8 years. Alone. Last 5. She didn't ask the follow-up question. She looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece, and then she looked at her hands, and he understood that she had understood. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Long time ago." "Doesn't matter how long ago." He set a plate in front of her. She looked at it with an expression that had nothing polite or performed about it, just genuine, uncomplicated hunger and gratitude, and she picked up a fork and ate. And Samuel sat across from her and ate too, and outside the storm continued its business, while inside his kitchen, which had been silent for 5 years, held the sound of two people eating breakfast. It was not nothing. He hadn't realized until that moment how much it was not nothing. After breakfast, she washed the dishes without being asked and dried them and put them away in the right places, which meant she'd paid attention during the 30 seconds she'd had to observe the kitchen while he was cooking. He noticed that. He was a man who noticed things, and he noticed that she noticed things, and that information settled into a corner of his mind where it would stay until he knew what to do with it. He went out to feed the horses. When he came back an hour later, she had found the pile of torn work shirts near the side door, a pile he had been meaning to deal with since September, and she had a needle and thread from God only knew where, and she was sitting at the table methodically repairing each one. He stood in the doorway. "Those were due for the rag pile," he said. "They're good shirts," she said, not looking up. "Just need attention." "You don't have to do that." "I know. You're a guest. I'm a person who tore through your flower supply and owes you something for a night's shelter." She bit the thread and moved to the next shirt. "Let me be useful." He looked at her for a moment. Then he took off his coat, hung it on the peg, and went about his afternoon. By the end of that first full day, 3 things had happened that Samuel would turn over in his mind for a long time afterward. First, his 2 ranch hands Delbert and Amos, who had been with him for 4 years and were not by nature warm toward strangers, had both tipped their hats to Emily when they came in for supper. Delbert had done it automatically, the way you tip your hat to someone you've already decided deserves the gesture. Amos had done it deliberately with a nod that meant something specific to a man of few words it meant acceptable. Second, the stable boy Eli, who had taken to appearing near the main house at increasingly transparent pretexts, had spent 20 minutes in the kitchen listening to Emily explain how to determine a horse's health from the quality of its coat, and had left visibly taller than he'd arrived. Third, Samuel Walker caught himself at some point in the early evening listening for the sound of her moving around. Not watching, not waiting for her to need something. Just listening involuntarily and without permission for the particular sound of another person existing in the same space as him. He had not done that in 5 years. He went to bed that night telling himself it was only because she was a stranger, and strangers bore watching. He was not entirely convincing. What he did not know, lying there in the dark with the storm finally quieting outside, was that in the guest room at the end of the hall, Emily Harper was awake too, with the leather envelope pressed against her chest, and her father's forged documents arrayed in her memory, like a map she had memorized so well she could navigate it in the dark. She was not thinking about warmth or shelter or breakfast. She was thinking about the courthouse in Cheyenne, which she needed to reach before her uncle's lawyer did. She was thinking about the window she had, which was small and closing. And she was thinking with the particular clarity of someone who has run out of every alternative about what it might mean to ask for help from a man she had known for less than 24 hours. The storm had stopped. The road would be passable by morning. And Charles Whitmore, Emily knew with absolute certainty, was already looking for her. Outside the cabin, the snow lay clean and white and undisturbed in every direction, and the stars above Wyoming burned with the cold indifference of things that have been there long before human trouble arrived, and will be there long after it's resolved. Inside, 2 people, who had each decided long ago that they were done being known by anyone, lay awake in separate rooms, neither of them sleeping, neither of them knowing the other wasn't sleeping either. And the night held them both. Emily did not sleep past 4 in the morning. She lay still for another hour after waking, listening to the silence where the storm used to be, and then she got up dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen to start a fire in the stove. Not because she was cold, because moving was the only thing that kept the fear from settling into something permanent. She had 3 days, maybe 4, before her uncle's lawyer filed the injunction that would freeze her father's estate in legal limbo long enough for Charles Whitmore to complete the transfer of title. She had the evidence to stop it. What she didn't have was a way to get it in front of the right judge before that window closed. She was standing at the stove, coaxing the fire to life with a piece of kindling, when she heard Samuel's boots on the floor behind her. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He came to the stove and stood beside her, and took the kindling from her hand without asking, and adjusted the angle of it. The fire caught. He stepped back. "Neither could I," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the fire. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to hear all of it before you answer." A pause. Then, "All right." She turned to face him fully. "I need to get to Cheyenne. I need to get there before the 15th, which gives me 3 days. I have documents here." She pressed her hand flat against her coat. "That prove my uncle has been committing fraud against my father's estate for 6 years. Forged signatures, falsified land records, a transfer of property that happened 2 weeks after my father died using a document that couldn't possibly be legitimate because I was present when my father made his actual will, and this isn't it." She stopped. "Let that settle. If I can get these papers to the Territorial Land Office before his lawyer files the injunction, I have a chance. If I can't, you lose everything," Samuel said. "Everything my father built. Everything he intended to leave me." "Yes." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Not the assessing look from the night before. This was something different. This was a man actually thinking, working through something he wasn't sure he wanted to work through. "Your uncle know where you went," he said. "He knows I ran. He doesn't know where I am. He'll know by tonight." "How?" "Because he has money," Emily said, "and money buys information, and in a territory this size, a woman traveling alone in a blizzard is not exactly invisible." Samuel was quiet for another few seconds. Then he said, "The road to Cheyenne will be passable by mid-morning. It's 2 days' ride, hard weather. 1 day if you push." "I know." "You don't have a horse." "I know that too." He looked at the envelope against her chest. "Those papers, are they the only copies?" "Yes." "Then if something happens to you—" "Then he wins," Emily said. "Which is why nothing can happen to me." The plainness of that, the absolute absence of self-pity in it, seemed to land on Samuel differently than he expected. He looked away. He looked at the window, which was showing the first gray light of pre-dawn, the sky beginning to separate itself from the black of full night. "I've got a man who rides into Cheyenne twice a month for supplies," he said finally. "He was due to go this week anyway. I'll send him with a letter to the land office, let them know what's coming. Buys you a little time on the legal side." He paused. "And I'll take you there myself." Emily stared at him. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." "Mr. Walker." "Samuel." "Samuel." She stopped, tried again. "You don't know me. You don't know if what I'm telling you is true. For all you know, I'm the one—" "You walked through a blizzard in boots that weren't fit for the weather," he said, "carrying papers you wouldn't let go of even when you could barely stand up. You didn't ask for money. You didn't ask me to fight anyone. You asked for 1 night." He picked up his coat from the peg. "People who are lying don't usually ask for that little." She looked at him. He looked back, steady, gray-eyed, entirely unreadable, in the way of a man who has decided something and doesn't see the need to perform the decision. "Thank you," she said, quietly, meaning it. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We ride in 2 hours. They told Delbert and Amos before breakfast." Delbert nodded, the way he nodded at everything slowly, with the gravity of a man who believed most problems benefited from the same response as a slow nod. Amos said nothing, but looked at Emily with the particular regard of a man reassessing something he thought he'd already figured out. Eli was in the yard when they came out, ostensibly checking the water trough, which did not need checking. "Are you leaving?" he asked Emily. "For a few days," she said. Eli looked at Samuel. "You taking her to Cheyenne?" "Mind your business," Samuel said. "Yes, sir." A pause. "You taking the gray or the bay?" "The gray." Eli nodded. "Gray's faster, but she spooks at rifle shots." Another pause. "Just so you know, in case there's rifle shots." Samuel looked at him. "Why would there be rifle shots?" Eli shrugged with the extreme innocence of a 13-year-old who knows considerably more than he's letting on. "No reason," he said, and went back to checking the trough. Emily looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at the horizon. "He talks too much," Samuel said. "You said that already." It keeps being true. They were on the road before the sun cleared the mountain line. Emily, riding the gray mare who was as advertised fast, and who was eyeing the tree line with the energy of a horse waiting for something to be startled by, and Samuel on a broad-chested black gelding that moved through the snow with the patience of an animal that had been doing this for years and had opinions about it. For the first hour, they didn't speak much. The cold had come back with the dawn, a drier cold than the night before, the kind that made your lungs feel like paper every time you breathed too fast. Emily kept her breathing steady, kept her posture straight, kept the envelope secure against her body, even though her fingers had been numb for 20 minutes. "You're not going to tell me you're cold," Samuel said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not cold," she said. "Your ears are the color of a barn door." "I'm fine." "There's a spare scarf in the left saddlebag." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead. She reached into the left saddlebag and found the scarf, heavy wool dark blue, worn soft from years of use. She wrapped it around her neck and the lower half of her face without saying anything. "Thank you," she said from inside the wool. They rode on. It was somewhere in the second hour, when the road had begun climbing toward the ridge that separated the valley from the main territory trail, that Emily said, "How long were you married?" Samuel's jaw moved. 3 years. What was her name? A pause. "Catherine." Emily waited. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't close down, either, didn't set his jaw in the way she'd seen men do when they'd decided a subject was finished. He just rode, and the name sat in the cold air between them, and she let it. "She was funny," he said finally, unprompted. People didn't expect that from her because she was quiet, but she had this way of saying things just one sentence at exactly the right moment that would stop a whole room. A pause. "She thought I was too serious." "Were you?" "Probably." "Are you still?" He thought about that. Actually thought about it, which she was beginning to understand was characteristic. He didn't perform consideration. He actually did it. "Don't have enough people around to know," he said. Emily smiled, though he couldn't see it behind the scarf. "You seemed fairly serious when you answered the door with a rifle." "That's just practical. Most people just call out who's there. Most people haven't lived at the edge of the territory for 8 years. Fair enough, she thought. They stopped to water the horses at a creek that was still running beneath its ice. Samuel found the open stretch 50 yards upstream from where she would have stopped, because he knew the creek, and she didn't, and he handed her hardtack and dried venison from the saddlebag without ceremony, and she ate it standing up, because there was nowhere dry to sit, and he stood beside her and ate his own without talking, and the silence between them was easier now than it had been at dawn. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel said. "You've been answering my questions for 2 hours. Seems fair. Your uncle, how long has he been—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "At this. I think he started moving money the year before my father died," Emily said. "Small amounts at first. Things that could be explained. A bad season. A cost I didn't know about. My father trusted him completely. They were brothers." She stopped. The last word had an edge to it that wasn't grief exactly. More like the specific bitterness of watching something good be used against itself. He had access to everything. The accounts, the deed. She paused. "The lawyer is his now. I figured that out about 6 months ago. What happened 6 months ago? I found a discrepancy in a payment ledger that my father kept separately, not in the main accounts. A personal record he'd been keeping since the ranch was first established. My uncle didn't know about it because my father gave it to me the week before he died, told me to keep it safe, told me I'd understand why later. She pressed her hand against the envelope. I understood why last spring. What did you do? I confronted my uncle. She said it simply flatly, the way you describe something you've already processed all the feeling out of. I told him I knew. I told him I had the ledger, and I had the original will, and I was going to the land office. She paused. He didn't lose his temper. That's the thing people don't understand about men like him. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He sat back in his chair and he said, "Emily, who do you think they're going to believe, me or you, won't you?" Samuel didn't say anything. He was watching her with the flat gray eyes that she was learning to read or starting to learn to read, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there before. Something that was not pity. Something harder than pity. He had a point, Emily said. That's the part I have to be honest about. A woman like me bringing accusations like this in a territory where he has established relationships, a known reputation and money. She stopped, started again. It takes more than being right. It takes being able to prove it in a way they can't explain away. That's why the ledger matters. That's why I need to be the one standing in that land office with it in my hand. Because if he gets there first, he files the injunction, and then the ledger becomes a point of dispute rather than evidence, and disputes can take years and in years. He finishes what he started, Samuel said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "We should keep moving." And he turned to his horse and mounted, and she did the same, and they went on up the ridge as the sun climbed over the mountains, and the territory stretched out before them, enormous and cold and indifferent and hers to navigate. They reached the first way station, a trading post with a bunkhouse attached, used primarily by freighters, and the occasional mail rider by early afternoon. Samuel had been here enough times that the man behind the counter, a wide Swede named Bjorn, who appeared to have been installed there permanently, sometime in the previous decade, nodded at him with the recognition of an old transaction. Walker. Bjorn, we need a room for the night and a meal. Bjorn looked at Emily, then looked at Samuel, then looked at Emily again, with the expression of a man drawing and filing a conclusion he had no intention of voicing. "One room," Samuel said, and his voice had a quality in it that Emily recognized as the end of a subject. "She gets the bed. I'll take the floor." $2, Bjorn said. Fine. They ate at the single long table in the post's common room, stew dense and good, the kind of food that exists only to restore the body rather than please it. Along with two other travelers, a surveyor heading south, and an older man who identified himself only as a minister going west. The minister said grace before the meal, which he did at considerable length, and Samuel sat across from Emily, with his hat on the table, and his hands folded, and his eyes slightly unfocused, in the way of a man enduring something politely. When it was done, the minister looked at Emily with the specific evaluative regard of a man who believed he was called to assess the spiritual weight of strangers. "You're traveling far, ma'am," he said. "Cheyenne," Emily said. "With your husband." Emily looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at his stew. "Yes," Emily said. The minister nodded approvingly. The surveyor made a sound that might have been suppressed amusement. Samuel ate his stew without visible reaction, which was itself a form of reaction. After supper, when the minister and the surveyor had gone to the bunkhouse and Bjorn had disappeared behind his counter with a lantern and what appeared to be a book of accounts, Emily and Samuel sat alone at the long table with the remnants of the meal between them. "You could have corrected him," Samuel said. "I know." "Why didn't you—" Emily turned her coffee cup in her hands. Because a married woman traveling with her husband toward Cheyenne is a woman with a reason and a companion. A single woman traveling with a man she met 24 hours ago is a subject of conversation. She looked up at him. And I've been the subject of enough conversations. He looked at her steadily. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected him to say that. She'd braced for something else, some mild objection, some slight performance of propriety. But he just said it simple and flat and went back to his coffee. Your uncle going to send someone after you, he said. He'll send Charles Whitmore, Emily said. He's my uncle's, I don't know what to call him. His enforcer seems dramatic. His instrument is probably more accurate. He's a lawyer technically, though he does considerably more than legal work. What kind of man? The kind who is always polite, Emily said, which is much more frightening than the kind who isn't. Samuel looked at her. How far behind us do you think he is? If my uncle found out I was gone by last night, which I believe he did, then Whitmore will have started riding this morning. He knows the territory better than I do. He'll know the way station route. She paused. He's probably half a day behind us, maybe less. The fire in the way station hearth cracked and settled. From somewhere outside came the sound of wind beginning again. Not the screaming wind of the previous night, but the steady, purposeful wind of a territory that was always in the process of testing things. We leave before dawn, Samuel said. I know. You should sleep. I will. He stood up, picked up his hat, looked at her across the table just for a moment. A look she couldn't entirely parse, something between assessment and something else she didn't have a clean name for. You're going to be all right, he said. The papers you have, if they're what you say they are. They're what I say they are. Then you're going to be all right. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't know that. No, he said. But I know you walked 3 miles through a blizzard, and you're still upright, and that tells me something about your odds. He went to the room. She sat for a little longer by the fire, turning her coffee cup in her hands, thinking about Charles Whitmore on a fast horse on the territory road behind them. Thinking about the courthouse. Thinking about her father's handwriting in the ledger, meticulous, careful, the handwriting of a man who understood that the record of a thing was often the thing itself. She was still thinking about it when she went in. Samuel was already on the floor, his coat beneath him, his hat over his face, his breathing deep and slow, in a way she was not entirely sure was genuine. She lay on the bed with the envelope under her pillow, and her hand resting on top of it, and she looked at the dark ceiling, and she thought one more day. Just one more day, and the papers would be where they needed to be, and the story could change. She didn't know yet how many things would change along with it. She was asleep before she finished the thought. They were in the saddle before the sun. The second day of riding was harder than the first. The cold had sharpened overnight, and the road, which had been passable the day before, had a new layer of ice over it that made the horses work twice as hard for half the speed. Emily rode without complaint. Her back ached. Her hands, even inside the gloves Samuel had produced from somewhere without comment, were stiff in a way that had moved past pain into a kind of permanent tension. She kept riding. Sometime in the late morning, Samuel said, "There's a rider behind us." Emily did not turn around. "How far?" "Half a mile, maybe less, moving fast." "One rider." "One." She kept her eyes forward. "Whitmore. Could be anyone. On this road, at this speed, at this distance." She shook her head. "It's Whitmore." They rode in silence for another minute. She could feel Samuel working through the same calculation she was working through: how far to Cheyenne, how fast the rider was closing, whether the horses had enough left to push. "There's a shortcut," Samuel said. "Cuts through a ranch I know. Saves maybe 40 minutes. Road's not maintained, but it's passable." "Is it faster than him?" "If we go now." She looked at him. He was already watching her, waiting. "Go," she said. He turned off the road. She followed without hesitation, and they moved through the snow-covered scrub at a pace that was not reckless, but was close to it. The gray mare picking her footing with the focused intensity of a horse that had finally found something interesting to do, the black gelding moving beside her with the steady competence of an animal that trusted its rider completely. They didn't look back. Behind them on the main road, the single rider continued south. He did not take the turn. Emily let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Did he miss it?" she said. "Looks like. Or he knows where we're going and he's taking the main road straight to Cheyenne." "That too," Samuel said. She looked at him. "You could have led with that." "Didn't want to take it from you." She stared at him. "Take what from me?" "The 30 seconds where you thought we'd gotten clear." She didn't know what to say to that. She turned back to the road ahead, the rough, unmarked, snow-covered track through someone's back pasture, and rode on. And after a moment, she said very quietly, "That was kind." Samuel didn't answer. He just rode, and she rode beside him, and the territory opened up before them in the particular way of a place that doesn't care what happens on it, but that carries the imprint of it anyway. The way land always does, accumulating weather and decisions, and the movements of people who passed through it without knowing they were leaving something behind. They reached the outskirts of Cheyenne in the late afternoon, with the light going flat and cold above the rooftops and the streets, loud with the particular noise of a territorial capital wagons, voices the hammering of a smithy somewhere to the north. After 2 days of mountain silence, it hit Emily like a physical thing. "The land office closes at 5, Samuel said. She looked at the sun. "We have 20 minutes. Then we move." They moved. She was through the door of the territorial land office at 4 minutes to 5 with the envelope in her hand, and Samuel Walker 2 steps behind her, and the clerk behind the counter looked up with the expression of a man who had been hoping to close early. "We're about to." "I know," Emily said. "I need to file an emergency contest of title under Section 4 of the Territorial Land Act. I have documentation of fraud in the transfer of the Harper estate registered in Carbon County executed 18 months ago." She put the envelope on the counter. "And I need it time-stamped today." The clerk looked at the envelope, looked at her, looked at Samuel. Samuel said nothing. He stood slightly behind her left shoulder, and he did not cross his arms, did not speak, did not do anything that could be interpreted as presenting himself as the authority in the room. He simply stood there, present and solid and completely still in the way of a man who understood that this moment was hers. The clerk looked at the envelope again. He reached for his stamp. The door behind them opened. Charles Whitmore walked in. He was exactly as Emily had described him. Polite, well-dressed, the kind of man whose dangerousness was almost entirely contained within the calm quality of his voice and the patience in his eyes. He looked at Emily. He looked at the envelope on the counter. He looked at the clerk's hand hovering over the stamp, and he smiled. "Miss Harper," he said pleasantly, "what a remarkable journey you must have had." Emily did not turn around. "Stamp it," she said to the clerk. The clerk looked at Whitmore. "I wouldn't do that just yet," Whitmore said in the same pleasant tone. "That documentation is the subject of an injunction filed this morning in this very office by the rightful executor of the Harper estate, who filed this morning when," Emily said. Whitmore paused. "Just slightly. Just long enough." "Check your records," Emily said to the clerk. "What time was the injunction filed?" The clerk turned to his register. His finger moved down a column of entries. 11:42 a.m., he said. Emily turned around and looked at Whitmore for the first time. "Samuel's man rode out yesterday morning," she said. "He filed a notice of contest at 9:15 a.m. It's in your records, Mr. Whitmore. My filing preceded your injunction by 2.5 hours. The pleasantness in Whitmore's expression didn't disappear. It just shifted. Thinned became something more effortful, the smile of a man recalculating. "The contest of titles still requires a hearing," he said, "during which my client will present—" "I know how a hearing works," Emily said. "Schedule it." She turned back to the clerk. "Stamp it," she said again. The stamp came down. The sound of it was very small in that quiet office, just ink and metal and paper. But Emily felt it land in the center of her chest, like something releasing a tension she had been holding since the night she stood in her uncle's study and understood what he was. She picked up the time-stamped documents. She put them back in the envelope. She held the envelope against her chest one more time out of habit, and then she put it on the counter and said to the clerk, Please log those in your evidence record." "Yes, ma'am." She turned around. Whitmore was still there. He would be. Men like him didn't leave rooms. They waited for rooms to change around them. "Your client is going to lose," Emily said. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just as a statement of what was true. "The ledger my father kept is in that envelope. The original will is in that envelope. The transfer document your client used, I have a notary's statement indicating the signature is inconsistent with every other signed document my father produced in the last decade of his life. He's going to lose." She paused. "And I think you've probably known that since this morning when you saw what was already filed." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his eyes that she couldn't entirely name. Then he put his hat on, nodded once, a small, precise, deeply professional nod, and walked out. The door closed behind him. The clerk exhaled. Emily did not. She stood in the middle of the land office with her hand still pressed flat against the empty space where the envelope had been, and she breathed slowly once and then again until the shaking in her hands was something she could manage. Behind her, Samuel Walker said nothing. He waited. And when she finally turned around, her eyes were dry and her chin was level, and she looked like a woman who had just won the first round of something that wasn't over yet, which was exactly what she was. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Steady, gray-eyed, entirely still. "You did that," he said. "You got me here. You would have gotten here. Not in time." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and outside the territorial capital went about its business with complete indifference, and inside the land office something was happening between two people who had known each other for 3 days, that neither of them had words for yet, but that both of them felt with the specific clarity of something that cannot be unfelt once it's been noticed. "There's a hotel 2 streets over," Samuel said. "Decent one. We should get off the road. And tomorrow you have a hearing to prepare for." He picked up his hat. "Tonight you sleep." She looked at him. "You're staying." "Through the hearing," he said. "Then we'll see." She wanted to argue. She had a whole case she had been building in the back of her mind, the reasons he should go home, the reasons this wasn't his fight, the reasons a man who barely knew her had already done more than anyone had a right to expect. She had every word of it ready. She didn't say any of it. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They walked out into the cold Cheyenne evening, and the street closed around them with its noise and its movement, and Emily Harper, who had walked into a blizzard 3 nights ago, with nothing but frozen boots and a leather envelope, and the ragged end of her last option, walked down the main street of the territorial capital, with her head up and her hands steady, and a man beside her who had asked for nothing and given something she hadn't known to ask for. She didn't know what to call it yet. She only knew it was real. And that night in a decent hotel 2 streets from the land office, with her father's documents safely logged in the territorial evidence record, and the hearing set for 3 days out, and Charles Whitmore somewhere in this city recalculating every move he had. Emily Harper lay in a real bed for the first time in 4 days and felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time. She thought of her father. She thought of the ledger, his careful handwriting, the way he had pressed it into her hands and said, "Keep this safe. You'll understand why." She had understood, and she had kept it safe. And somewhere down the hall in a chair, he had pulled in front of the door, because he was a man who made decisions once and then made them completely. Samuel Walker sat with his rifle across his knees and his eyes open, watching the door, keeping watch over the woman he had let into his house during a blizzard for 1 night. 1 night that had now become 4. He wasn't counting. The morning of the hearing, Emily woke at 3 a.m. and didn't go back to sleep. She sat at the small table in her hotel room with her father's ledger open in front of her and went through every page for the 4th time. Not because she didn't know what was in it, but because the physical act of reading her father's handwriting steadied her in a way that nothing else did. His words, his numbers, his careful, meticulous record of everything he had built and everything he had intended to leave behind. She ran her finger along the lines, and she said quietly to no one in the room, "I've got it, Papa. I've got it right here." At 5, there was a knock at her door. She opened it. Samuel stood in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had also not slept. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "No." He handed her a cup. She took it and stepped back to let him in, and he came in and sat in the chair near the window without being invited, which she'd noticed was a habit of his, not presumption exactly, but the natural movement of a man who didn't perform comfort. He was either comfortable or he wasn't, and tonight he wasn't, and he sat in the chair and held his coffee with both hands and looked at the ledger open on the table. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Like I'm about to walk into a room full of people who have already decided what I am," she said, "and convince them they're wrong." "That's accurate. Thank you for the honest assessment. Would you prefer a different one?" "No." She sat back down at the table. "What time did you fall asleep?" "I didn't." She looked at him. He looked at his coffee. "Samuel, I've gone longer without sleep. That's not—" She stopped, started again. "You've been awake for 2 days. You rode 2 days through bad weather, you sat in a chair outside my door all night, and you're going to sit through a legal hearing that has nothing to do with you. And then what? Ride 2 more days home. That was the general plan, yes. That's a terrible plan. I've had worse." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the ledger on the table. There was something in his face that she was beginning to be able to read, a particular stillness that wasn't indifference, but the opposite of it, the stillness of a man who felt things with more intensity than he had the habit of expressing, and had learned to hold it inside where it didn't get anyone into trouble. "Why?" she said. He looked up. "Why are you still here? You got me to the land office. You did what you said you'd do. Why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, because Whitmore is still here. That's the practical reason. I'm a practical man." "Samuel." He set down his coffee. He looked at her the way he looked at things he was deciding how honest to be about. "Because you're going to walk into that hearing, and you're going to stand there with everything stacked against you, and you're going to be right, and it matters that somebody who knows you're right is in the room." A pause. "That's all." She looked at him. "That's not a small thing," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at her coffee. He looked at the ledger. And they sat like that in the quiet of the early morning. 2 people who had known each other for 4 days and felt in some unspoken and as yet unnamed way that this was longer than it sounded. The territorial courthouse was a 2-story building on the main street of Cheyenne that smelled of wood stain and pipe smoke and the particular authority of a place where decisions got made that people had to live with afterward. Emily walked in at 8:30 with the ledger under her arm and the time-stamped filing in her hand, wearing the best clothes she'd been able to manage from what she'd packed. A dark wool dress pressed as well as a hotel iron could manage it. Her hair pinned precisely, her bearing perfectly upright in the way of a woman who has made the decision to be mistaken for someone with nothing to prove. Samuel walked in beside her. He was not her lawyer. He was not her husband. He had no official standing in this proceeding, and they both knew it. But he walked in beside her at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried, and when they entered the hearing room and found it already occupied by 3 men on one side of the table, Charles Whitmore, another man Emily didn't recognize, and her uncle himself, Samuel did not hesitate. He moved to the chair directly behind Emily's seat at the respondent's table and sat down, and he put his hat on his knee, and he looked at the room with the flat gray eyes of a man who was not impressed and was not afraid. And that was that. Her uncle Edmund Whitmore looked older than she remembered, smaller somehow. He was a well-built man of 60, with a face that in her childhood she had trusted completely, and she made herself look at him directly as she sat down, because the alternative was to look away, and she was not doing that anymore. He met her eyes. He looked away first. The presiding officer was a territorial judge named Aldous Crane, who was somewhere in his late 50s, compact, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who appeared to have been born already impatient with people who wasted his time. He opened the proceedings without preamble, summarized the matter in 3 sentences, with the precision of someone who had read the filings carefully, and looked at Whitmore. "Contestant's position," he said. Whitmore rose. "Your Honor, my client, Edmund Harper, is the legally recognized executor of the Harper estate under an instrument of transfer executed and registered 18 months ago. The contest being brought by Miss Emily Harper represents a misunderstanding of the legal instruments involved, which my client is prepared to clarify with full documentation." Judge Crane looked at Emily. Respondent. Emily rose. She was aware of the room. She was aware of the 3 men across the table, the judge behind his bench, the clerk in the corner, Samuel 2 feet behind her. She was aware of all of it, and she set it aside and she spoke. "Your Honor, the transfer instrument my uncle refers to was executed using a forged signature," she said. "My father, Robert Harper, made his actual testamentary intentions known in a will drafted by his personal attorney in the spring of 1883, which names me as primary beneficiary of the ranch property and associated holdings. That will is in the documentation I filed yesterday. The transfer instrument my uncle presented 18 months ago uses a signature that I can demonstrate through comparison with 16 years of signed documents in my father's own business ledger is inconsistent with his established handwriting in multiple specific respects." She opened the ledger on the table. "Additionally, this ledger kept personally by my father and given to me directly in the week before his death documents a pattern of unauthorized financial transfers from estate accounts beginning in the year before his death, totaling approximately $14,000, none of which appear in any official estate record my uncle has produced." The room was very quiet. Judge Crane looked at the ledger, then he looked at Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "does your client contest the authenticity of the ledger?" Whitmore rose smoothly. "We have not had the opportunity to examine. It was filed with the office yesterday morning," Judge Crane said. "Your client filed an injunction at 11:42 a.m., which means he was already aware of the contest filing before the injunction. Your client had the opportunity." A pause, pointed and precise. "Does he contest the authenticity of the ledger?" Whitmore looked at Edmund Harper. Something passed between them, a look quick and complex, the look of 2 men recalibrating in real time. "We request a 2-week continuance to examine the—" "Denied," said Judge Crane. "I've reviewed the documentation. The handwriting comparison Miss Harper references is apparent to any reader of the ledger and the disputed transfer document. I'd like to hear from a witness." He looked at Emily. "You mentioned your father's personal attorney. Is he available?" Emily had been hoping for this and dreading it in equal measure. "He was available as of last month, Your Honor. He's in Laramie. I sent a letter 3 days ago, but I don't know." The door at the back of the hearing room opened. A man came in. He was in his 70s, thin and sharp-featured, wearing a travel coat that still had road dust on it, moving with the careful speed of someone who had been traveling for a long time and was not quite finished. He came in and stopped when he saw the room, and his eyes went immediately to Emily. And something in his face shifted relief mostly, with something complicated underneath it. "Mr. Aldous," Emily said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Miss Harper." He came to the table and set down his bag and straightened up and looked at the judge. "I'm Nathan Aldous. I was Robert Harper's attorney for 22 years. I drafted his final will, and I witnessed his signature on it, and I have been trying to get someone to listen to me about that transfer document since the week it was filed." He looked at Edmund Harper across the table. "I know that signature is a forgery because I was present when Robert Harper signed every legal instrument he ever executed. And that," he pointed not dramatically, but with the precision of a man who had been waiting a long time to make this gesture, "is not his signature." Edmund Harper stood up. "That man has a personal grievance against my family," he began. "Sit down, Mr. Harper," said Judge Crane, with the tone of a man saying something for the last time. Edmund sat. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Emily had not been wrong about the evidence. She had been right precisely and demonstrably right in every specific claim she had made. The ledger entries corresponded to dates of unauthorized transfers. The attorney's testimony confirmed the existence of a legitimate will. Himself, comparing the disputed signature against 16 years of documented examples, produced a silence in the room that said more than any argument could. But being right was not the same as winning, and Emily knew it, and she sat through each witness and each counter-argument and each of Whitmore's attempts to reframe the evidence with the stillness of a person who could not afford to show what this was costing her. Behind her, Samuel Walker did not move. He sat with his hat on his knee and his hands quiet in his lap and his attention completely on the proceedings. And once, when Whitmore tried to characterize Emily's father's ledger as a personal document with no legal standing, and once, when Edmund Harper's second attorney suggested that Emily's motivations in this matter were those of a woman who had never properly understood her father's estate plans. Samuel's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that Emily, who had turned to glance at him, saw it. He didn't say anything. He wasn't there to say anything. But the tightening of his jaw meant something, and she knew what it meant, and knowing it helped her turn back to the table and keep going. The first major turn came at the end of the second hour when Whitmore produced a letter. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to submit correspondence from Mr. Edmund Harper to his brother Robert dated March 1883, in which Robert Harper explicitly agrees to the proposed transfer of certain ranch properties to Edmund's management in the event of Robert's death, in consideration of debts owed." Judge Crane took the letter, read it, looked at Nathan Aldous. "Mr. Aldous, were you aware of any debts owed by Robert Harper to his brother?" Aldous looked at the letter. He read it carefully, and Emily watched his face, and what she saw there was not recognition, but the particular controlled expression of a man encountering something that doesn't surprise him, but that he wishes surprised him. "That letter," Aldous said carefully, "is dated 3 days before my client made a significant change to the scope of his will, a change specifically removing Edmund Harper as a beneficiary. He called me to his study, and he told me—" He stopped. He said he had discovered that certain debts he had previously believed were legitimate were not. That he had been made to believe he owed his brother money for transactions that upon review my client had in fact paid in full. He had the receipts. The room went still. "He had the receipts," Judge Crane repeated. "Yes, Your Honor." "And where are those receipts now?" "They were in a strongbox my client kept in his study." Aldous paused. A strongbox that, according to the estate inventory filed by Edmund Harper 18 months ago, contained nothing relevant to the property transfer. Every head in the room turned to look at Edmund Harper. He was very still. He was looking at the letter in the judge's hand, and he was still, and for the first time since Emily had walked into this room, she could see him calculating the distance between where he was and where the door was. "Mr. Harper," said Judge Crane. Edmund looked at the judge. "Do you have any documentation of the debts referenced in this letter?" A pause, long enough to mean something. "I would need time to locate—" "In your possession," said the judge. "At this time, any documentation." Edmund looked at Whitmore. Whitmore looked at the table. "No," Edmund said. The second major turn came 40 minutes later, and Emily had not seen it coming. A man came to the door, not dramatically, not at a run, just a knock, and the clerk went to answer it, and there was a brief murmured conversation, and then the clerk came to the judge and handed him a folded paper. Judge Crane read it. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did a slight forward lean, the lean of a man absorbing new information that has just changed the shape of the problem. He looked at Edmund Harper. "Mr. Harper," he said, "I've just been informed that the county sheriff in Carbon County has this morning executed a warrant for the examination of records at the Harper Ranch based on a complaint filed last week by a ranch employee regarding irregularities in payroll documentation." He set the paper down. "Were you aware of this complaint?" Edmund Harper's face did something complicated. "I was not. The complaint was filed," the judge said, "by a man named Delbert Crane. No relation to myself. He's listed as a senior ranch hand at the Harper property for 11 years. Emily's head turned involuntarily toward Samuel. Samuel was looking at the judge, and his face was entirely neutral, and he did not look at her. But the faintest thing, the very faintest suggestion of something moved through his expression for exactly 1 second, and then was gone. Delbert, she thought. She thought of Delbert's slow nod at the breakfast table, his hat tip in the evening, the particular quality of his nodding, which she had read as simple agreement, but which she now understood was the nod of a man who had already decided something before you finished talking. She thought of Samuel 2 nights ago saying, "I'll send a man with a letter to the land office." She had assumed the letter was only to the land office. She looked at Samuel again. He was still watching the judge. She turned back to the front of the room and pressed her hand flat against the table and breathed once carefully. He had sent 2 letters. He had sent the letter to the land office to secure her filing, and he had sent a second letter to Delbert, or through Delbert, or to someone who could get to Delbert to put in motion something that would open a second front against her uncle. A front that had nothing to do with Emily's evidence and couldn't be connected to her, which meant it couldn't be dismissed as the grievance of an interested party. She thought he said he was a practical man. She thought I didn't understand the half of it. The hearing broke for midday at Judge Crane's order, with a resumption set for 2 o'clock. Emily stood when the room stood and turned, and Samuel was right there 2 feet away, already on his feet, with his hat in his hand. She looked at him. He looked back. "Delbert," she said, very quietly. "Good man," Samuel said. "Known him 4 years. He doesn't do anything he doesn't believe in." "You sent him a letter." "I sent him information. What he did with it was his own business." "Samuel." "You had the legal case," he said. "I just made sure the legal case wasn't the only thing in the room." She looked at him for a long moment. The hearing room was emptying around them. The clerk gathering papers, Whitmore speaking quietly and intently into Edmund Harper's ear, Nathan Aldous carefully packing his bag with the air of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and could feel it beginning to lift. "Why?" Emily said. "You know why," Samuel said. She did. She just wanted to hear him say it. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had learned in 4 days to read better than she'd read most people in years, and he said, "Because it was right. And because—" He stopped. Something moved through his face, something that was not easy for him and that he was choosing to let be visible anyway. "Because I wasn't willing to watch you lose something you'd walked 3 miles through a blizzard to save." The room was nearly empty. Outside, Cheyenne went about its noon business, indifferent. Emily looked at Samuel Walker, this man she had known for 4 days. This man who had stepped aside at his own door in a blizzard for a stranger who had sent 2 letters when he said he was sending one, who had sat in a chair outside her door all night with a rifle and come to her room at 5 in the morning with coffee and not once, not a single time, asked for anything in return. "Samuel," she said. "Yeah, when this is over." She stopped, wasn't sure how to finish. "I don't know what happens next." "No," he said. "I might win today, and there might still be—" "I know. There could be appeals. There could be more hearings. My uncle has money, and he will use it, and this could go on for—" "Emily." She stopped. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated steadiness of a man who has made up his mind about something and is not interested in performing the uncertainty he doesn't feel. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She stared at him. "One thing at a time," he said. "First the hearing, then we figure out the rest." She wanted to argue. She had arguments ready, reasonable ones about the length of 4 days and the impossibility of what he was implying and the danger of decisions made in the middle of a crisis. She had all of it organized and available. She looked at him, and none of it came out. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They ate the midday meal at a lunch counter 2 doors from the courthouse beef stew again, which seemed to be the recurring theme of Emily's life this week, and Nathan Aldous joined them, and the 3 of them sat at a narrow counter and ate without talking much, because there wasn't much to say that wasn't better saved for afterward. And Emily sat between 2 men who had shown up for her in ways she hadn't asked for, and hadn't expected, and didn't know what to do with, except accept carefully the way you accept something fragile. The afternoon session was different from the morning. The energy in the room had shifted. Edmund Harper had shifted. He was still at the table, still upright, but something in his bearing had changed, a collapse of some internal scaffolding that was not visible in any specific gesture, but that you could feel if you'd been watching him since morning. Whitmore was still smooth, still professional, still finding every procedural angle available, but he was building with less material now, and he knew it. The afternoon's most significant moment came at 3:15. The sheriff's report from Carbon County arrived by telegraph. The clerk read it aloud at Judge Crane's request in the quiet hearing room, and what it contained was this: during the examination of the ranch records that morning, deputies had found inside a locked cabinet in the estate office a strongbox. Inside the strongbox were receipts. The receipts corresponded exactly to the debts Edmund Harper had claimed his brother owed him, the debts cited in the letter he had used to justify the transfer of the property. Every receipt bore a date. Every date was before the March 1883 letter. Every receipt bore Robert Harper's signature. The debts had been paid. The letter claiming otherwise had been sent, knowing the debts were paid. The transfer of property had been executed on the basis of debts that Edmund Harper had known at the time he filed the transfer did not exist. The room was very quiet after the clerk finished reading. Judge Crane took his glasses off, rubbed his eyes, put his glasses back on. He looked at Edmund Harper for a long time. Edmund Harper was looking at the table. "Mr. Harper," the judge said, "I'm going to ask you to step outside with the bailiff while I confer with counsel." Edmund stood. He was careful about it, stood the way a man stands when his legs are not entirely trustworthy, and he is making sure no one can see that. He straightened his coat. He walked to the door without looking at Whitmore. He did not look at Emily. He walked out, and the door closed. And in the 23 minutes that followed, while Judge Crane conferred with both attorneys in a low voice that Emily could not entirely hear, she sat very still at the respondent's table, with her hands in her lap and her father's ledger in front of her, and she looked at nothing in particular. Samuel's hand came to rest on the back of her chair, not on her shoulder, not touching her. Just there, his hand on the back of the chair, present and solid and still. She put her own hand back and set it next to his, not touching, just close. Neither of them moved. When Judge Crane called the room back to order at 4 o'clock, his voice had the quality of a man who had something unpleasant to do and had decided to do it cleanly. "In the matter of the Harper estate," he said, "I find the transfer instrument filed 18 months ago to be of questionable validity, sufficient to warrant referral to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation of potential fraud and execution. The injunction filed this morning is vacated. The contest of title filed by Miss Emily Harper is sustained pending the Attorney General's review, during which time the estate assets will be held in receivership under this court's supervision." He looked at the table where Whitmore sat alone. "Mr. Whitmore, you may advise your client accordingly." Whitmore rose. "Your Honor, we would request—" "That's all, Mr. Whitmore," said the judge. He looked at Emily. "Miss Harper, you have the court's sympathy for the circumstances that necessitated this proceeding. The documentation you provided was well organized and clearly presented." A pause. "Your father kept thorough records." "Yes," Emily said. "He did. He trusted the right person with them." She didn't answer. She couldn't quite write at that moment. Judge Crane nodded. He gathered his papers. He stood. The room stood with him. He walked out. And for a moment after the door closed, the hearing room was just a room, wood and paper, and the smell of pipe smoke and afternoon light coming in through the window, and 3 people at one table and the clerk in the corner, and the absence of Edmund Harper, and the presence of everything that had just happened. Nathan Aldous sat down in the chair he'd been standing in and put his face in his hands. Not crying, just done. Just finished. Like a man who has been holding tension in his body for 18 months and has just been told he can stop. Emily looked at the window. She thought of her father. She thought of him pressing the ledger into her hands and saying, "You'll understand why." She had been 25 then, standing at his bedside in the thin winter light of a Carbon County morning, not understanding why he was so emphatic about a book of numbers. Not understanding until the spring, when she found the discrepancy. Not understanding entirely until right now, when she was sitting in a Cheyenne courtroom with the receivership order still warm from the judge's hand, and the knowledge certain and clean and final that she had done what he needed her to do. She understood now. She reached out and put her hand flat on the ledger, on the worn cover, on the place where the leather had softened from years of her father's handling. She kept it there for a moment. Just a moment. Behind her, Samuel said nothing. He understood that this wasn't his. He waited. When she took her hand off the ledger and turned around, her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had just won something enormous, and who knew clearly that there was still work ahead. That a receivership order was not the same as a deed in her name. That Whitmore and her uncle would find angles she hadn't thought of yet. That this was the end of the first part, and not the end of the whole. She knew all of it, and she looked at Samuel Walker, who was standing 2 feet away from her with his hat in his hand and his gray eyes level, and she said, "Let's go home." He looked at her. Something moved through his face, quick, deep, and real. "Yeah," he said. She picked up the ledger. She picked up the filing. She nodded to Nathan Aldous, who raised a hand in acknowledgement from behind his own hands, and she walked out of the hearing room with Samuel at her side, and they came out into the late afternoon cold of a Cheyenne street that smelled of coal smoke and horse, and the particular metallic edge of a sky that was thinking about snow. Emily stopped on the top step. She breathed in, breathed out. The cold hit her throat and her lungs, and she let it, and she stood there on the courthouse steps of Cheyenne, Wyoming in December of 1886, with her father's ledger in her hands, and she felt the particular gravity of a moment in which more than one thing was ending, and more than one thing was beginning, and she did not yet know how to separate them from each other. Samuel stood beside her. "You all right?" he said. "I'm not sure yet," she said honestly. He nodded. Like that was a reasonable answer. Like he had learned in 4 days, or in the years that preceded them, that some questions don't have immediate answers, and that the right thing to do when someone tells you that is to stand beside them while they figure it out. The street moved below them. The city moved around them. Above them, the sky was going the color of old pewter. And somewhere to the north, Emily knew there was a valley with a ranch in it, and a small cabin with a fireplace, and a kitchen that had burned biscuits in it 4 days ago, and a mending basket she hadn't finished, and a stable boy who talked too much, and 2 ranch hands who tipped their hats. She didn't own that place. She didn't live there. She had spent 4 days there, and 1 night in a hotel room, and 2 days on the road, and 1 afternoon in a courthouse. She pressed the ledger against her chest with both hands, and she thought quietly, privately, like something she wasn't ready to say out loud. But I know what home feels like now. And it didn't feel like the ranch her uncle had stolen. It felt like something else entirely. They rode home in 2 days through weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Half snow, half freezing rain, the kind of weather that gets into the seams of your coat and stays there. Emily didn't complain. Samuel didn't either. They rode mostly in the kind of silence that had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere between the way station and Cheyenne and had become something else, something with texture and weight, the silence of 2 people who had said enough important things that the quiet between them now carried meaning instead of absence. On the second night, camped at the same way station as before, Bjorn looked at them across the counter with the same expression he'd had the first time, drawing and filing conclusions, and said nothing which Emily was beginning to think was his highest form of approval. They ate. They sat by the fire longer than they needed to. Samuel said, "What are you going to do after?" Emily looked at the fire. "There's still the receivership. The Attorney General's review could take months. Could take longer if my uncle contests every step, which he will." She paused. "I need to be available. I need to be somewhere I can get to Cheyenne quickly if I need to." "That's practical," Samuel said. "Yes." "I wasn't asking about the practical part." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire the same way he always looked at things he was being indirect about directly, but at the thing adjacent to what he meant. "I know," she said. A long pause. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. "My father's ranch is in receivership. The house I grew up in is technically under court supervision. I can't go back there." She stopped. "I haven't had anywhere to go since the night I threw that lantern." "You could stay," Samuel said. The fire crackled. "At the ranch," he said, which was either clarifying or unnecessary, and they both knew which one. Emily looked at her hands. "Samuel, you'd have your own room, same one you had before. Eli would be insufferable about it, but he'd get over it. Delbert wouldn't say anything. Amos might say one thing and then never mention it again." He paused. "You could work. You're useful. You already know where everything goes in the kitchen, which took Catherine 6 months, and you did it in one morning." It was the second time he'd said Catherine's name in her presence. She noticed. "That's a very practical argument," she said. "I'm a practical man." "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." She looked at him for a long moment. He was still looking at the fire, but there was something careful about the set of his jaw. Something that told her this was not as easy as he was making it sound, that the offer was real, and the reason behind it was real, and that he was leaving her every possible exit, because he understood somehow that a woman who had just spent a week fighting for the right to her own life needed to feel that every choice she made was genuinely hers. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "I'll stay," she said. "For now. While the receivership is active, it makes practical sense." "Yes," he said. "It does." "And because—" She stopped. "Because it's the only place in recent memory where I felt like a person, rather than a problem." He was quiet for a moment, then very quietly. "Good. Just that. Good." Like it was the only word that fit, and he wasn't going to dress it up into something it didn't need to be. They rode into the valley the next afternoon, and the ranch appeared through the tree line the way things appear after you've been away from them long enough to see them clearly for the first time. The cabin, the barn, the smoke rising from the chimney. That meant someone had kept the fire going in their absence, the gray winter sky above it all, and the whole thing sitting in the snow like it had always been there, and intended to keep being there. Eli was at the gate. He was not ostensibly checking anything. He was just standing at the gate. "You're back," he said, looking at Emily. "We're back," she agreed. "Did it work?" He couldn't contain it. He was 13 years old, and he had been keeping a secret for a week, and it showed in every line of his face. "Delbert said he wouldn't tell me what he did exactly, but he said he did something that was supposed to help." "It helped," Emily said. Eli exhaled. The relief on his face was enormous and completely unguarded. The relief of a child who has been carrying adult-sized worry for a week and has just been told he can put it down. "Good," he said. Then, with the recovery speed of a 13-year-old, "The gray mare's left shoe is loose. I noticed it this morning." "You noticed it now," Samuel said. "I noticed it this morning when I was checking because I knew you'd be back today." "You didn't know we'd be back today. I had a strong feeling." Samuel looked at the boy for a moment with the expression he always used for Eli, which was the expression of a man trying to be stern about something he was not actually stern about. "See to the shoe," he said. "Yes, sir." Eli took the gray's reins. Then he looked at Emily. "I'm glad you're back," he said simply and directly, the way children say true things before they learn to hedge them. "So am I?" Emily said. She meant it. Delbert was in the barn when they came in, and he looked up from what he was doing, repairing a harness methodically the way he did everything, and his eyes went to Emily, and he nodded once with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict. Emily looked at him. "Delbert," she said, "I understand I have you to thank for something." "Didn't do anything I wasn't planning to do anyway," he said. "Been watching the books on this ranch for 4 years. Things Mr. Walker mentioned lined up with things I'd been thinking about. Figured it was time to stop thinking and start doing." He went back to the harness. "Glad it helped, ma'am." "It did more than help," Emily said. It may have been what turned it. Delbert nodded again. Not uncomfortable with the thanks, but not particularly moved by it. Either. The nod of a man who does right things and expects that to be sufficient without requiring recognition. You planning on staying? He said with the directness of someone who considered small talk an inefficiency. For a while, Emily said. Another nod. Good. Kitchen was better. It was Emily understood the highest compliment Delbert was capable of. Amos found out she was staying when he came in for supper and found her at the stove. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and then at Samuel, and then back at her, and then he said, And he sat down, which for Amos was a speech. That night after supper, after Eli had gone to the bunkhouse, still talking, and Delbert and Amos had gone to their rooms and the cabin had settled into its nighttime sounds, Emily sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the meal and her father's ledger, which she couldn't quite seem to put in a drawer yet, and Samuel sat across from her with his coffee. They all know, Emily said. They've known since the second day, Samuel said. Known what exactly? He looked at his coffee. That you were going to stay. She looked at him. Did you know? He thought about it, which was his characteristic thing, actually thinking about it. I thought it was possible, he said. After the biscuits. She stared at him. After the biscuits. Burned biscuits mean you're not performing, he said. People who are just passing through perform. They're polite, they're careful. They try to make a good impression. You burned the biscuits and then you laughed at them. He paused. I couldn't remember the last time someone laughed in this kitchen. Emily looked at the kitchen. At the mended curtains, she'd done those the second morning, found needle and thread in a drawer, fixed the hem that had been fraying. At the herbs in the small pot, she'd moved to the sill on the fourth day, because the light was better there. At the chair where she'd spent 3 mornings with the mending basket, working through the pile of shirts that were not actually ready for the rag pile. She'd been making herself at home without realizing she was doing it. I didn't mean to, she started. I know, Samuel said. I'm not trying to, she stopped. I know what it looks like. I know what it looks like too, Samuel said. I don't mind what it looks like. She looked at him for a moment. Samuel. Yeah, I need you to understand something. She looked at the table, looked back up at him. I don't need to be saved. I didn't need saving when I knocked on your door, and I don't need it now. I needed shelter, and I needed help, and I'll tell you when I need those things. But I don't need... I know that, Samuel said. I just want to be clear. You've been clear since the first morning, he said, when you told me you weren't going to fall and then didn't fall. A pause. I've been clear too. I didn't let you in because I thought you needed saving. I let you in because it was the right thing to do and because... He stopped, looked at his coffee. You'll have to let me work up to the because. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then, in spite of everything, she almost smiled. All right, she said. Work up to it. Might take a while. I appear to have some time. He looked up, and for a moment in the lamplight of that small kitchen. There was something in Samuel Walker's expression that she had not seen there before. Not quite a smile, not quite vulnerability. Something between the two. Something that a man only lets through when he has decided that the person across from him is worth the risk of being seen. She looked back. She didn't look away. The weeks that followed were not quiet. That would have been too simple, and life in the Wyoming Territory in December of 1886 was never simple. The Attorney General's office sent a representative to the valley within 10 days, a young man named Price, who wore clothes that were not appropriate for the weather, and who asked good questions and wrote everything down in a small leather notebook with the intensity of someone who understood that the details mattered. He interviewed Emily for 2 hours. He interviewed Nathan Aldis by correspondence. He interviewed Delbert, who answered every question with the minimal possible number of words and maximum possible accuracy, which Price appeared to find either refreshing or unsettling. Emily couldn't tell which. Edmund Harper's attorney filed 2 separate appeals within the first month. Both were heard. Both were denied. The first denial came on a Thursday. Emily read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and said nothing for a long moment, and then looked at Samuel and said, "One," and Samuel said one, and that was the extent of the celebration, because they both understood that one was not done. The second denial came 6 weeks later on a Tuesday morning when the valley was in the grip of a cold snap that had frozen the water troughs solid and sent Eli inside complaining about his hands. Emily read that letter standing up at the kitchen counter and said, 2. And Samuel, who was across the room putting on his coat to go deal with the water troughs, stopped and looked at her and said, "How many does he get?" "I don't know," Emily said honestly. "His lawyer is thorough. Thorough is what you do when you know you're losing, but you're getting paid to keep trying." That's an accurate description of Mr. Whitmore's current situation. Yes. Samuel finished putting on his coat. "He'll run out of angles." "He'll run out of angles," Emily agreed. "It's the timeline I can't control." He looked at her. "You all right with that?" She thought about it. The honest answer, not the manageable answer. "Some days," she said. "Some days it's fine. Some days I wake up at 3 in the morning and count what I still don't have, and the list is long." "And then what do you do?" "Come to the kitchen and start a fire," she said. "Make coffee, read my father's ledger." She paused. "Sometimes you show up." Something moved through his face. "I hear you up," he said. "I know. I don't come to—" "I know," she said. "You come because you're awake too and the coffee is better here." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's why." Neither of them said anything about the other reason. The third month brought something none of them had anticipated. Charles Whitmore came to the ranch. Not with legal papers, not with a court summons. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in January alone on a horse that had been ridden hard, and he knocked on the door with 3 deliberate knocks that managed to sound professional, even in the middle of a working ranch. Emily opened the door. Whitmore looked at her, took his hat off. "Miss Harper," he said, "I'd like to speak with you, privately if possible." Emily looked at him for a moment, looked past him to where Samuel had appeared at the corner of the barn, his attention on the visitor with the still-focused quality of a man calculating distances and options. She looked back at Whitmore. "Come in," she said. She heard Samuel's footsteps cross the yard. They sat at the kitchen table, Whitmore across from Emily. Samuel standing near the doorway, not seated, which was its own form of statement. Whitmore looked at Samuel once and then addressed himself to Emily entirely, which Emily gave him credit for because it was the right choice. "My client has authorized me to make a settlement offer," Whitmore said. Emily waited. "Edmund Harper will relinquish all claim to the ranch property, the livestock, and the main accounts in exchange for the court agreeing not to pursue criminal charges for the financial transfers." He set a document on the table. "He keeps the house in Carbon County, his personal residence, not part of your father's estate, and 30% of the liquid assets currently held in receivership." Emily looked at the document. She did not touch it. "He's frightened," she said. It wasn't a question. Whitmore's expression didn't change. "He's making a practical decision." "He's frightened," Emily said again. "The Attorney General found something in the records, didn't he?" "Something beyond what I brought in. The receipts weren't the end of it." A pause. Very brief. But it was there. "The offer is on the table," Whitmore said. Emily looked at him steadily. "What did they find, Mr. Whitmore?" Another pause. He looked at the document on the table. He looked like a man navigating between the professional obligation of not answering and the practical reality that she was going to find out regardless. "The payroll irregularities that Mr. Crane's complaint opened," he said carefully, "led to an examination of the ranch's operational accounts over the past 6 years. The examination identified transfers inconsistent with normal operating costs." He stopped. "Consistent with a pattern that the Attorney General's office considers actionable under territorial fraud statutes." Emily stared at him. "How much?" she said. "That's a matter still under review." "How much, Mr. Whitmore?" He looked at her. Then precisely. The current estimate is in the range of $31,000. The kitchen was very quiet. Samuel moved just slightly, just a shift of his weight, but Emily felt it from across the room. $31,000. Over 6 years. While her father was alive. While her father trusted his brother. While she was living in that house believing that the accounts were what they appeared to be. She thought of her father's face. She thought of the way he had handed her the ledger. She thought of the specific weight of the word he had used. Keep this safe. Not file this, or give this to a lawyer, but keep this safe. The word of a man who understood that what he was giving her was something more than evidence. The offer, Emily said. In exchange for dropping criminal charges. Yes. He wants immunity. He wants resolution, Whitmore said with the careful language of a man who is not personally asking for this thing, but is professionally obligated to present it. Emily looked at the document for a long time. No, she said. Whitmore looked at her. I'll take the ranch and the accounts, Emily said. All of them not 70%. And I won't interfere with the Attorney General's investigation. What they do with what they find is their business, not mine. She pushed the document back across the table. My business is my father's estate. What they find beyond that is a matter for the territory. Miss Harper, Whitmore said, I want to be clear that accepting this offer would likely result in a more expedient resolution. Without it, the legal process could take years, Emily said. I know, I've been told. She looked at him. Mr. Whitmore, in the 4 months I have been involved in this matter, I have been called confused, delusional, mistaken, and in one of your client's more creative filings, susceptible to misapprehension due to grief. I have walked 3 miles through a blizzard. I have ridden 2 days in freezing weather. I have sat in a courtroom and proven point by point in front of a judge that everything I said was true. She paused. I'm not in a hurry to give my uncle a comfortable exit. He can have whatever the Attorney General decides to give him. That's not my department. A pause. Tell him no. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the document. He folded it precisely the way he did everything, and he put it in his coat, and he stood and put his hat back on, and looked at Emily with an expression she could not entirely read. Something that was not admiration, not quite, but was in the family of admiration. I'll convey your response, he said. Thank you for coming in person, Emily said. You didn't have to. No, he agreed. I didn't. He looked briefly at Samuel. Samuel looked back. Something passed between them that wasn't friendliness but wasn't hostility either. The acknowledgement of 2 men who had been on opposite sides of a thing and had both conducted themselves in a way the other could respect without agreeing with. Whitmore left. Emily sat at the table. Samuel didn't say anything for a moment. Then he came and sat across from her in the chair where Whitmore had been and looked at her. $31,000, he said. Yes. Over 6 years. While my father was alive. A pause. He knew, Samuel said. Not a question. I think he suspected, Emily said. I think that's why he kept the ledger separate. I think that's why he gave it to me. She looked at her hands on the table. I think he knew he couldn't prove it alone, and he didn't know who to trust, and he thought if something happens, Emily will know what to do with this. She stopped. I almost didn't, but you did. I almost didn't, she said again, because it mattered to her to say it honestly. I sat on it for 2 months after I found the discrepancy. I was afraid. I knew what he'd say about me, a woman like you, who's going to believe I knew all of it, and I was afraid of it, and I almost just let it go. She looked up. I didn't, but I almost did. What changed? Samuel said. She thought about it. I read the ledger again, she said. The last entry my father made, 3 days before he died. He wrote, I trust this will find the right hands, and then my name. She looked at the table. He didn't hedge. He didn't say he hoped I'd be brave enough or smart enough or strong enough. He just wrote my name, like it was a certainty. Samuel was quiet for a moment. It was, he said. She looked at him. He was right, Samuel said. It was a certainty. She stared at him, and something in her chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency around this man. This quiet, practical, infuriating, steady man, the thing she had not yet named, because naming it felt like the most dangerous thing she'd done in a season full of dangerous things. "You're very certain about things," she said. "Some things," he said. "Which things?" He looked at her with the gray eyes she had now spent 4 months learning to read. "The things that matter," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Samuel," she said. "Yeah." "Work up to it yet?" He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked up, and what was in his face when he did had not been there 4 months ago, or it had been there, but it had been held under the surface, kept in the particular way of a man who has learned to keep things until he's sure of them. "I think," he started, stopped, tried again. "I think Catherine would have liked you." Emily stared at him. "She would have seen right through the whole burned biscuit thing," he said. "She would have known you did it on purpose, to see how I'd react." "I didn't do it on purpose," Emily said. "I genuinely cannot cook biscuits." "I know. I have tried many times since. I know, they've all been terrible. They've been improving. Emily." He said it quietly, cutting through the deflection with the precision of a man who had timed his moment. "I didn't let you in that night because I thought it was the right thing to do. That's what I told myself because it was easier than the other thing." He looked at her directly. "I let you in because you knocked on a door in a blizzard, and I couldn't not open it. I couldn't not open it because the way you stood there, you were half frozen and your legs were going, and you still looked at me like you were the one deciding whether I was worth trusting." A pause. Nobody had looked at me like that in 5 years. Emily was very still. "That's the because," he said. "That's what I needed to work up to." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the winter wind of the valley that came and went like a long argument that never fully resolved, just paused and resumed. From the direction of the barn, Emily could hear Eli's voice talking to one of the horses, the sound of it thin and clear in the cold. "Samuel," she said. "Yeah. I didn't know I was doing that." "I know. I was looking at you like that because you were holding a rifle, and I was making a threat assessment." He almost smiled. It was very close to a smile. "I know," he said. "Doesn't change what it looked like." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she hadn't done since the morning of the biscuits, hadn't done in 4 months of living in this house, and sharing meals at this table, and sitting by this fire. She laughed. Genuine warm, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and unexpected. The kind that is not a performance of anything, but just the outward sign of something actually being funny. Samuel looked at her. He was smiling. Not a suggestion of a smile. An actual smile, small and real, and transforming his face into something she had not quite seen from him before, something that made her understand very suddenly and very clearly what he must have looked like in the years before Catherine died, when the world was still a place he expected good things from. She stopped laughing. Not because it wasn't funny anymore, because the smile had changed things. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I came here for one night," she said. "I had one plan, and it was to get to Cheyenne and file those papers and win the estate back, and then figure out what came next. I had it all sequenced. I knew exactly what I was doing." She stopped. "I had no plan for this." "This," he said. "This, you, here, whatever this is." He looked at her. "Does it need a plan?" She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about things that mattered. "No," she said. "I don't think it does." He nodded, like that was the reasonable conclusion, and he was glad they'd arrived at it. "One thing," he said. "I need you to know one thing." "All right. I'm not asking you to stay because I'm lonely," he said. "I was lonely before you got here. I know what that is. That's not this." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to stay Because the ranch is better with you in it. I'm better with you in it. And because I think you might be—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "Better here too." She looked at him. "Not because you need to be here," he said. "Because you might want to be." 4 months ago, she had stood in a blizzard with frozen boots and a leather envelope, and nothing else. And she had knocked on a stranger's door, and the stranger had stepped aside, and she had walked into warmth that she thought was only for one night. She looked at Samuel Walker across the kitchen table in the lamplight of a January evening with the wind outside and the fire going, and the sound of Eli's voice still carrying from the direction of the barn, and she thought about wanting. She had not let herself think about wanting specifically for a long time. Wanting was a risk. Wanting was the thing her uncle had used against her father, the wanting to trust, the wanting to believe the best of someone. She had taken wanting and put it in a drawer after her father died, and she had lived on practical things, on necessity and strategy, and the clean logic of what was required. She thought about what it cost to keep living that way. She thought about 4 months of breakfasts at this table, and evenings by this fire, and 3 a.m. coffee, and the way Samuel moved through his own house, careful and contained, opening up degrees at a time like a window, being raised slowly, letting in just enough air to see if it was safe. And she thought about how she understood that completely. And she thought about how understanding it completely was itself a kind of answer to a question she hadn't known she was being asked. "I want to be here," she said. Samuel looked at her. "Not because I don't have anywhere else," she said. "Because I want to be here. There's a difference." "There is," he said. "And I want—" She stopped, felt the courage required for what she was about to say, recognized it as the same courage required to walk through a blizzard, the same courage required to walk into a courthouse, the courage that is just the willingness to keep moving toward what matters, even when it costs you something. "I want to know what this becomes. I don't know what it is yet. I don't think you do either. But I want to know." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, "I want to know too." Outside, Eli came out of the barn and crossed the yard, his boots crunching on the packed snow, his voice going quiet as he got to the porch, having apparently concluded that if he could hear whether or not there were two people talking in the kitchen, he would know something about the state of things. And the resulting silence told him what he needed to know, and he went to the bunkhouse without coming inside, which was for Eli an act of enormous and unprecedented restraint. In the kitchen, Emily and Samuel sat at the table with the lamp between them and the fire behind them, and the winter doing its winter things outside, and they did not say anything else for a little while, because not everything that matters needs more words than it already has. But at some point, Emily reached across the table and put her hand on the table between them, not reaching for his hand, just putting hers there, open, present, which was its own kind of statement. And after a moment, Samuel put his hand on the table beside hers, not touching, just there, and that was enough for now. Outside, the territory went on in its tremendous, indifferent, ordinary way, and the snow fell or didn't fall, and the stars appeared or didn't appear, and the valley held the ranch, and the ranch held the cabin, and the cabin held two people who had each lost something irreplaceable, and found in the wreckage of that loss the particular kind of courage that allows a person to look at another person and say, "I want to know what this becomes," which is, when you think about it, the bravest thing there is. The Attorney General's final report arrived on a Wednesday morning in March, carried by a rider who had come from Cheyenne through 2 feet of late-season snow and who accepted coffee from Emily with the gratitude of a man who had earned it. The report was 43 pages long. Emily read every word of it at the kitchen table, while Samuel sat across from her and drank his coffee and did not ask questions, because he had learned by now that Emily Harper read important things the way she did. Everything important completely, without interruption, with the specific focus of a woman who understood that the details were not separate from the story, but were the story. She finished at noon. She set the report down on the table. $38,400, she said. Samuel looked at her. "That's the final figure," she said. 6 years of transfers, falsified payroll, manipulated operating accounts. She paused. They found 2 additional properties my father owned in Carbon County that had been quietly transferred to shell accounts my uncle controlled. I didn't even know about those properties. What does the report recommend? Referral for criminal prosecution, Emily said. The Attorney General is filing charges: fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. She looked at the table. Whitmore isn't named. They found no evidence he was aware of the full scope. I believe that, actually. He's a thorough man, but he wasn't informed of everything. She paused. Edmund did that alone. Samuel was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? She thought about it. Honest, not managed. I feel like I've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, she said. And someone just told me I can put it down, and I'm not sure yet whether my arms remember how to stop holding on. He nodded, like that was a real answer, and he was taking it seriously. What happens to the estate? He said. The receivership ends, she said. The ranch reverts to me outright. The accounts are restored minus what was taken. The Attorney General's office will pursue recovery through the criminal proceedings, but that could take years and I may never see most of it. She picked up the report and then set it back down, a gesture of someone who wasn't sure what to do with the thing they'd been waiting for. But the land is mine. The cattle records. My father's name on the deed passed to me the way he intended. She stopped. That's what matters. That's what always mattered, Samuel said. She looked at him across the table. This man who had stepped aside at a door 5 months ago and had not stopped being steady since. Who had sent 2 letters. Who had sat in a chair outside her room. Who had told her she would be all right and meant it not as reassurance, but as assessment. Who had put his hand on a kitchen table beside hers and said, I want to know too. Samuel, she said. Yeah. I need to go back to Carbon County. He looked at her. I need to see the ranch, she said. My father's ranch. I need to go there and stand in it. I don't know how to explain that. I need to see it with the knowledge that it's mine. I need to see the study where my father kept his desk, and the barn where I learned to ride, and the kitchen where... She stopped. I need to go. When? He said. Soon. While the weather is still. She stopped because the weather was not the point, and they both knew it. All right, he said. You don't have to... I know. It's a 4-day ride. Emily. She looked at him. When? He said again. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, Sunday. Sunday, he said. That was all. They ate lunch. Emily washed the dishes. Samuel went to tell Delbert that they'd be gone for 2 weeks, and Eli appeared in the doorway of the kitchen approximately 40 seconds after Samuel walked out, which meant he had been within earshot of the kitchen window for some portion of the morning. You're going to see your ranch, he said. You were listening, Emily said. I was nearby, Eli said. The window was open. It's March, Eli. No one opens windows in March. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. Are you coming back? He said. Emily looked at him. She thought of this boy who had given a frightened woman directions in the dark, and then spent 5 months watching the results of that decision unfold around him, carrying it with a seriousness that his 13-year-old face couldn't quite contain. I'm coming back, she said. How do you know? She thought about it, honestly. Because this is where I live, she said, which was the first time she had said it in exactly those words, and the saying of it felt like something clicking into a place it had been looking for. Eli nodded slow and grave, the nod of a boy absorbing information he intended to keep. Okay, he said. Then, you want me to check the gray mare's shoes before Sunday. The right rear has been... Eli. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, she said, for the directions, 5 months ago. He looked at her, then he looked at the floor. Then he looked back up with the expression of a child who has just been told something that has gone straight to a place that matters and doesn't know what to do with it. You were going to be fine, he said. I could tell. Could you? You knocked like you meant it. he said. "Most people who are really scared knock like they're afraid of the door too. You weren't afraid of the door." Emily stared at him. He shrugged the shrug of a boy who has said something true and is now finding the weight of it mildly inconvenient. He left the kitchen. A minute later, she heard him outside talking to the gray mare, his voice carrying the same quality it always did. Too fast, too much information, entirely genuine. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. Then she picked up her father's ledger, which was on the shelf where she kept it. Now, not the table, not under her pillow. On the shelf where things you have finished carrying go when they become something you simply own, and she held it for a moment. She put it back. They rode out Sunday morning. The road south toward Carbon County was different from the road to Cheyenne. Smaller, less traveled, the kind of road that requires you to pay attention because it has opinions about where it goes and doesn't always agree with where you're trying to get to. Samuel knew parts of it, and Emily knew other parts, and they navigated it together in a way that was easy now, in the way things become easy when they've been practiced into habit. The first day they talked about practical things, the receivership paperwork, the timeline for getting the ranch operational again, the question of what to do about the staff her uncle had kept, on some of whom were loyal to him, and some of whom had stayed because they needed work and would be loyal to whoever was running things. The second day they didn't talk as much. The country was opening up, becoming the country Emily had grown up in, and she rode through it with the specific quality of attention of a person recognizing things they hadn't known. They'd memorized a bend in the creek, the way a particular ridge caught the light, a cluster of cottonwoods that had been saplings when she was a child and were now thick and established and permanent. She didn't say anything about these things. Samuel didn't ask. He rode beside her and let the country do what the country was doing. On the third night, at a camp off the road because the nearest town was too small for a proper inn, they sat by a fire that Samuel built with the practiced efficiency of a man who has built 1,000 of them. And Emily looked at the stars, which were the same stars she'd looked at as a child from the back porch of her father's house, and she said, "He used to tell me that the land remembers." Samuel looked at her. "My father," she said. "He'd say the land remembers who worked it and who loved it, and that's a kind of ownership that doesn't show up in any deed." She paused. "I thought it was a nice thing to say. I thought it was something fathers said to make their daughters feel connected to things." She stopped. "I think he meant it literally." "Maybe it is literal," Samuel said. "Do you think that—" He looked at the fire. "I think the place I built has the shape of the person I was when I built it," he said. "I think Catherine is in the walls of that cabin, whether I like it or not. Not as a haunting, just as a fact of construction." He paused. "I think you're in those walls now too. In the curtains you fixed and the herbs on the sill and the shirts that are actually wearable now." He paused again. "I think land is like that. It remembers the weight of the people who loved it." Emily looked at him in the firelight. "That's the most you've ever said at one time," she said. "Don't tell anyone," he said. She almost smiled. "Your secret's safe." He looked at her for a moment. In the firelight, his face had the quality it sometimes had in lamplight, the quality of something that was not afraid to be seen, that had decided quietly and irrevocably that this was a person it was safe to be seen by. "You're going to be all right when you see it," he said. "I don't know that." "I do." She looked at him. "How?" "Because you've been all right through everything else," he said. "And this is the part that's supposed to be good." She looked at the fire. She thought, "I want him to be right." She thought, "I think he is." They reached the Harper Ranch on the fourth afternoon. Emily stopped her horse at the gate. The gate was the same gate she had run through as a child, the same wood, the same iron hinges, the same post that her father had reset twice over the years, because the ground in this part of the county shifted in the spring and took fence posts with it. Her name was not on it. The property had been in her uncle's name for 18 months, and the signs of it were there different in small ways. The gate hung slightly differently than her father had kept it. The main yard raked in a pattern her father had never used. She sat on the horse and looked at the gate. Samuel sat beside her and said nothing. She got off her horse and opened the gate. She walked through it. She led the horse through after her, And then she stood in the yard of the place where she had been born, and she looked at it. The house, the barn, the old oak her father had planted the year he married her mother, the kitchen window where she had stood 100 times watching the light change across the valley. She breathed in. The land smelled the same. That was the thing she hadn't expected, that under everything that had changed under the 18 months of her uncle's management, and the signs of different hands and different habits, the land smelled exactly the same. The particular combination of creek water and pine, and the mineral edge of the Carbon County soil that she had not known she'd memorized until she stood in the smell of it again, and her body recognized it before her mind caught up. She exhaled. She had not cried since her father died. She had not cried through the blizzard or the ride or the hearing or the Attorney General's report or any of the months in between. She had not cried because crying required a safe place to do it in, and she had not had one. She had one now. She cried for approximately 2 minutes standing in the yard of her father's ranch. Not dramatically, not with collapse, just with the steady and overdue release of a woman who had been through enough that the grief needed somewhere to go. Samuel stood nearby. He did not put his arm around her. He did not say anything. He stood close enough that she could feel his presence, and far enough that she had space. And when it was done, he took a handkerchief from his pocket and held it out, without looking at her, the handkerchief of a man who had thought ahead. She took it, wiped her face, breathed. "Thank you," she said. "Take your time," he said. She looked at the house. "Let's go in," she said. The house was smaller than her memory had made it, and larger than her grief had allowed. She walked through every room. She walked through the kitchen and the study and the parlor and her childhood bedroom, and she opened doors and looked at walls and touched things that had been her father's and were now hers. And Samuel walked behind her, at a respectful distance. Not filling the rooms with words, just being present, in the specific way that she had come to understand, was one of his defining qualities. He understood when presence was what was needed, and talking was not. In her father's study, she stopped. The desk was there. Rearranged slightly, some things missing the surface, cleared of her father's careful disorder and replaced with her uncle's different disorder. But the desk itself was there, solid and dark. The desk she had sat across from her father at 100 times. The carving on the front panel, R. Harper, 1861, was still there. She put her hand on it. She stood there for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair and sat in it. It was the first time she had sat at her father's desk. She had never sat here when he was alive. It was his place, his chair, his domain. She had always sat on the other side. She sat in it now, and it felt enormous and right and strange all at once, the way inheriting something always feels not a replacement for the thing that was, but a continuation of it. A carrying forward. Samuel appeared in the doorway. He looked at her sitting at the desk. Something in his face shifted, the small, genuine shift of a man seeing something that matters. "Looks right," he said. "It feels enormous," she said. "That'll change." She looked around the study. At the empty shelf where the ledger had lived before her uncle cleared it. At the window that looked out over the ranch. At the door that led to the hall where she had walked as a child, and as a young woman, and as a person who had not known yet what was coming. "I need to stay for a while," she said. "A few weeks, maybe more. Get the accounts in order, meet with the staff, see what needs doing." She paused. "It's my responsibility." "I know," Samuel said. "I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not choosing between here and—" "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. "You do. You told me you were coming back," he said. "I believed you." She stared at him. "I told Eli that." "I was nearby," Samuel said with a precision that made her understand he had heard the window conversation in its entirety and had been waiting for the right moment to acknowledge it. She looked at him for a moment. "You were listening. I was nearby," he said. "The window was open." She laughed. Again. The same way she'd been laughing for 5 months, surprised by it not performing it, the laugh of a woman who had found that this man could consistently produce in her the specific delight of being caught entirely off guard. He smiled. The actual smile, the one that changed his face, the one she had seen for the first time across a kitchen table in January, and had not been able to stop thinking about since. "I'll head back Sunday," he said. "Give Delbert the week and then get back to the ranch. The spring work starts soon." "I'll write," she said. "I'll write to Eli too, or he'll torment Delbert." "He'll torment Delbert regardless." "True." She paused. "Samuel." "Yeah." "Come back in 6 weeks," she said. "When I've got the accounts sorted and the staff settled and the worst of it done. Come back and see it when it's mine properly. When it looks like mine." He looked at her steadily. "6 weeks," he said. 6 weeks. He nodded, and then he said quietly, "It already looks like yours." She looked at him from behind her father's desk in her father's study on the land her father had built and her father had trusted her to save, and she thought, yes, it does. And so does something else. But she wasn't ready to say that yet. She was, however, no longer afraid to think it. The 6 weeks passed, the way work passes, not quickly because the work was hard, but forward, which was the only direction that mattered. Emily met with the staff and sorted the loyal from the indifferent, from the ones who had benefited from her uncle's management, and were waiting to see which way things went. She kept the first group. She let the second group decide. The third group she thanked for their service and paid what she owed them and showed them the gate with the complete absence of drama of a woman who understood that the time for drama had passed. She went through every account, every record, every piece of paper that bore her father's name or her uncle's signature or the shadow of 18 months of management that had not been hers. She worked 12-hour days and sometimes longer, and in the evenings she sat at her father's desk and wrote letters to Nathan Aldous, who was handling the legal side of restoring the estate records to the Attorney General's office, which had questions at regular intervals, to the Carbon County Land Office, to Eli, who wrote back in the handwriting of a boy who was taking the correspondence very seriously, and whose letters were, Emily told Samuel in her weekly letter to him, extremely detailed about the gray mare's physical condition and extremely vague about everything else going on at the ranch. She wrote to Samuel every week. He wrote back every week. His letters were short, not terse, short in the way that a man who chooses his words carefully is short, where every sentence carries the weight of several that didn't get written. He told her about the ranch and the spring work, and what Delbert had said about the north fence, and what Amos had said about nothing, because Amos never said anything, and at the end of each letter, in the same handwriting as the rest, but somehow different in register, he wrote something that was not quite the because he had mentioned in the kitchen, but was in the direction of it, a sentence or two that she read more than once and kept in the drawer of her father's desk in a small stack that grew weekly. The criminal proceedings against Edmund Harper began in the 5th week. Emily was called to testify. She went. She sat in the same kind of chair she had sat in Cheyenne 5 months ago, and she answered every question with the same precision she had brought to the civil hearing, and the experience of being asked the same questions by a different set of lawyers, with slightly different objectives, was exhausting in the specific way of things that are important and right and still cost you something. Edmund Harper sat across the room throughout. He did not look at her for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day, during a recess, he did. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was a long moment in which she was aware of everything that had been between them and was now changed. The trust, the family, the particular quality of the love she had had for him when she was a child, before she understood what he was. All of it was there in the look, and none of it was usable anymore. She held his gaze. He looked away. She walked out of the courthouse into the spring air of Carbon County and stood on the steps and breathed, and she thought of her father, and she thought, this is not the same as forgiveness. I'm not there yet. Maybe I won't get there. But I did what you needed me to do, and the record is set right, and that has to be enough for now. She thought it was. She went home and wrote Samuel a letter that was longer than usual. She didn't explain everything in it. She just told him what had happened, and then at the end she wrote, 6 weeks is almost up. I think I'm ready. And she sealed it and sent it. His reply came 4 days later. It said, I'll be there Thursday. He arrived on Thursday. Emily heard the horse in the yard before she saw him, and she came to the door of the study where she'd been working and went to the front door and opened it, and there he was riding into the yard of her father's ranch on the black gelding. Sitting a horse, the way he always sat, a horse like it was where he belonged. Looking around the property with the assessing eyes of a man who is seeing something for the first time and deciding what he thinks of it. He looked different on her land. Not wrong, the opposite of wrong. He looked like something that fit the way a person looks when they've arrived somewhere that suits them without knowing it was going to. He saw her in the doorway. He stopped the horse. "Emily," he said. "Samuel," she said. He got down off the horse. She came down the steps. She showed him the ranch. All of it on foot in the late afternoon light of a Wyoming spring, the barn, the paddocks, the creek that ran behind the east field, the old oak in the yard, the study where her father's desk sat in the light from the window. She showed him all of it, and she watched him see it, and she watched what he saw settle into him, the way things settle when they're real. "He built all this himself," Samuel said, standing in the barn, looking at the structure of it. Solid, well-made, the work of a man who had taken the time to do it right. "Him and 2 hired hands," Emily said. "Took 2 years. He used to say he'd built it to last longer than he would." "He was right," Samuel said. "He usually was," Emily said. "About most things." She showed him the study last. She opened the door and let him walk in ahead of her, and she watched him move through the room, looking at the bookshelf, looking at the window, looking at the desk with R. Harper on the front panel, and then looking at the chair behind it. He stood at the desk and looked at it for a moment. "Sit," Emily said. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said. "See what it looks like." He sat in the chair behind her father's desk. He looked at the room from that angle. He put his hands flat on the desk, the way men do when they're feeling the weight of a piece of furniture, the weight of what it has held. "What do you see?" Emily said. He was quiet for a moment. "I see the whole room," he said. "From here you can see every corner and both doors and the window and the yard." He paused. "Your father knew what he was doing. A man who sits here can see everything that matters." Emily looked at him sitting at the desk. She thought, yes, she thought that's exactly right. She said, "Samuel, I want to ask you something." He looked up. "I want to ask you, and I need you to hear all of it before you answer, which you'll remember is how I asked you the first time in your kitchen at 4 in the morning." The corner of his mouth moved. "I remember. I've been thinking," she said, "about what happens next. The legal proceedings will go on for a while, and the accounts need another season to stabilize, and there are things about this ranch that are going to require my presence for the foreseeable future." She stopped. "And there are things about your ranch that require your presence, and those are 2 different properties in the same territory, which means—" "Emily," he said, "I'm working up to something." "I know, I'm letting you." She looked at him. "I don't know what shape this takes," she said. "I don't know how you arrange 2 ranches and 2 sets of responsibilities and—" "Emily." She stopped. He stood up from the chair. He came around the desk. He stood in front of her in her father's study in the afternoon light, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that she had been reading for 5 months and could now read clearly. "I've been thinking too," he said, "about what happens next. And 2 ranches is a practical problem," he said. "Practical problems have solutions. You solve the practical problem and then you figure out the rest." He paused. "This territory is not that big. Delbert can run my place for a season while I'm here. Spring work is nearly done. And you—" He stopped, looked at her. "You could come back to the valley in the fall when the worst of the work here is done if you wanted to. Or not. Or something else that neither of us has thought of yet." She looked at him. "That's not much of a plan." "No," he said, "but it's a direction." She considered him. This man who had opened a door in a blizzard and had not once in 5 months asked her to be something she wasn't. Who had let her carry her own weight and carried some of it alongside her without making her feel the difference. Who had put his hand on a table beside hers and called it enough. Who had sent 2 letters when he said he was sending one because he was a practical man, and because he understood that sometimes the thing you love needs more than one angle of protection. "Samuel," she said. "Yeah, I want to ask you to stay," she said. "Not because I need the help. I'm going to be fine. I've been fine. I'll continue to be fine." She held his gaze. "I want to ask you to stay because this ranch has my father in the walls, and now I want someone else in the walls too. I want to cook terrible biscuits in that kitchen and have you tell me they're structurally useful, and I want to sit at that desk in the evening and know you're somewhere in the house, and I want—" She stopped, breathed. "I want to know what this becomes. You said that too, 5 months ago at a kitchen table. I want to know." He looked at her for a long moment. The study was quiet. The spring afternoon moved outside the window, the yard in the light, the oak casting its shadow across the ground, the land doing what land does, holding everything that had happened on it, the weight of years and work and grief and hope, all of it present and ordinary and ongoing. "I reckon," Samuel Walker said, in the voice of a man who has thought about something long enough that the saying of it is simply the last step in a journey already completed, "that we have been circling around the same thing since the night you knocked on my door." Emily looked at him. "I reckon," he said, "that a woman who knocked like she meant it and a man who opened the door have been moving toward this conversation for 5 months. "Are we having it now?" Emily said. "Seems like it," he said. He reached out and took her hand. Not tentative, not performed. He took her hand the way he did things decided, present, entirely genuine, and he looked at her and said, "I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean. You know that. I know that. So, when I say I love you," he said, "I need you to understand that I have been certain of it since somewhere around the second morning when you knocked that biscuit against the pan and laughed. And I have been working up to saying it since January at that kitchen table. And I am saying it now because we are standing in your father's house on your father's land that you fought for and won, and it seems like the right place to say it." Emily looked at him. She thought of a door in a blizzard. She thought of a rifle held easy across a left arm. She thought of coffee in a tin cup and a blanket from a chest and the particular quality of stepping aside that is not the same as stepping back. She thought of 2 days on the road and a hotel room and a land office and a hearing room and $31,000 and 2 ranch hands and a stable boy with too many opinions about horse health and a kitchen with curtains she had fixed and herbs on the sill and shirts no longer ready for the rag pile. She thought of her father pressing a ledger into her hands and saying, "Keep this safe. You'll understand why." She thought I understand why. She thought he trusted me with the thing that mattered most, and I did not let it fall, and standing here is what keeping it safe looks like. She thought of Samuel Walker putting his hand on a table beside hers and calling it enough. She looked at him. This man, this entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary man who had opened a door in the worst night of her life and had been steady every day since, and she said, "I love you too. I have been certain of it since the morning you told me the biscuits were structurally useful for fence repair." He looked at her. "That was the second morning," he said. "Yes," she said. It was. Something moved through his face, relief and warmth, and the specific particular quality of joy that belongs to people who have been through enough grief to know what the alternative feels like, and to feel the difference in their bones. He pulled her toward him. She let herself be pulled. They stood in her father's study in the light from the window on the land her father had built, and her uncle had stolen, and she had walked through a blizzard to save. And she put her face against Samuel Walker's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that for a long moment without words, because the words had all been said and what was left was just this 2 people holding on in a place that remembered them. Outside, the spring afternoon continued. The oak moved in the wind. The horses in the paddock made their horse sounds. The creek ran over its stones. The territory went on in its enormous, ordinary, ongoing way, holding everything that had happened on it and everything that was going to happen next, with the same patient indifference of land that has been here long and intends to stay. Inside, Emily Harper, who had thrown a lantern into the snow on the worst night of her life and walked 3 miles through a blizzard, with frozen boots and a leather envelope and a courage she had almost not recognized. As courage at the time stood in the house where she was born and understood, with the clean and total clarity of something that has always been true and has finally been named, that she was home. Not because the deed had been restored, not because the accounts were being reconciled, not because the record had been set right and her father's name was where it belonged, and the land remembered who had loved it. She was home because of the man whose arm was around her. Because home is not the place where your name is on the deed. Home is the person who steps aside to let you in when you have nowhere else to go, and then stays, and then chooses you, and then says so in a room full of the weight of everything it cost to get there. That is what home is. That is what it has always been. And Emily Harper, who had known this without knowing she knew it since the night a door opened and a man with gray eyes and a rifle and more steadiness than she had ever encountered in another human being, stepped out of her way and let her in from the cold. Emily Harper had come home, and she was staying, and the story of how she got there was over, and the story of what came next had just begun.